Also ich darf euch alle recht herzlich begrüßen, liebe Studierende, liebe Gäste, liebe Mitglieder vom Verband. Schön, dass ihr alle wieder da seid zu unserem zweiten Vortrag. Ich switch nachher gleich in Englisch, um dann unseren Gastredner gleich vorzustellen. Noch ein paar Dankesworte. Besonderen Dank natürlich an die Makromedia und an unseren Campusdirektor Matthias Wolf, der uns hier super unterstützt, damit es überhaupt hier auch zustande kommt. Natürlich dann auch unseren Verband und die Stadt Leipzig, die uns auch supporten. Und auch den Ronny Burkhardt-Swoda wieder von Media Seasons, der sich wieder bereit erklärt hat, die ganze Geschichte zu streamen. Auf dem YouTube-Kanal vom Verband könnt ihr euch das angucken, da wird es auch archiviert. So wie der erste Vortrag auch. Einfach mal reinschauen. Und ja, und natürlich auch meine Kollegen recht herzlichen Dank, ohne die das auch nicht zustande kommen würde. Wir haben ja den Jan Kardes und den Gerald Farka, die auch ganz ihre eigenen Leute auch an der Hand haben, die wir dann einladen werden, sodass wir auch eine schöne Mischung haben. Nicht nur von Game Producing oder Game Studies, wo jetzt der Gerald Farka sehr stark unterwegs ist, sondern auch von Game Art. Und deswegen denke ich, haben wir da eine schöne Mischung. Der nächste Vortrag ist dann im März. Wir haben das ja immer monatlich begleitend zur Vorlesungszeit. Und ja, so viel zu den Dankesworten. Ich komme dann, switch jetzt mal ins Englische. So I switch to English. Und ja, I'm very proud and it's very nice that we can welcome Jaroslav Švelch from the Czech Republic. Give him please a warm welcome. So we met us last year at the CGS, the Central and Eastern European Game Studies, and Gerald Farka is ill today, so but he's still writing the application for that we bring the Zx 2021 to Leipzig. And the good thing is Jaroslav is the head of the commission, I think.
Member.
A member, but a very important member of the commission. So maybe he will give us make the sum up, so that we get this nice conference to Leipzig. So some words about Jaroslav. Yeah, I need my paper because there is so much information. So you are as assistant professor at the Charles University in Prague. You have published work on history and theory of computer games, moral decision-making in games, on humor in games and social media, and on the grammar Nazi phenomenon. You're currently researching history, theory, and reception of monsters in games. Very, very interesting. In 2007 and 2008, you was a visiting researcher at the Comparative Media Studies Department at the MIT in Boston. And actually, you are the author of the recent monograph Gaming the Iron Curtain, How Teenagers and Amateurs in Communist Czechoslovakia Claimed the Medium of Computer Games, published at MIT Press. So, thank you very much that you've been here, and I will give you the microphone.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks everybody for being here. Thanks to all the organizers and Gerald, who might be watching from his bed, because I know he's ill, unfortunately. Yeah, so today I will be talking about history of computer games, and specifically history of computer games in communist Czechoslovakia. And this might sound very obscure, and it is kind of obscure, but I think for students of game design, I think it can teach some interesting lessons. I myself have been studying this topic for, it's been about 15 years now, and I always keep getting surprised by how people were making original creative games already in the 1980s without any kind of industry at all. This research, the lecture will be based on this book. This is a very thick book, so I'm only kind of following a bit of the story that's in there. But you can, if you like it, you can try. You can get the book. Yeah, it came out about a year ago, and I want to start with a I want to start today with a shout out to the computer industry of the GDR, because I'm quite old, and this was the first computer that I worked on. It was made in East Germany by Robotron. This was at my dad's office at work. He was a programmer at a matches factory, a factory that produced matches to light fire with. Yeah, so I was playing games on this computer and programming on this computer at his work. This computer even made it to an East German postage stamp. So it was a very famous computer. We didn't have, machines this good in Czechoslovakia that we would produce ourselves at that time. Okay, so yeah, we lost the connection. Yeah. Okay, so why even study computer games in Czechoslovakia or in the Soviet bloc? It was obviously a minor market or no market at all, so it didn't really have like long-lasting, commercial impact on game design or anything. But I think it's really valuable. I'm borrowing this quote from Sandra Bramman. So she wrote a foreword to this book. It's about the history of computer networks in the Soviet Union. And she said that she appreciates about this book the disorientation that results when the familiar is encountered in an unfamiliar context, broadening and deepening what we believe that we know about the familiar. So I believe that by looking at how games were being made and played in communist Czechoslovakia, maybe we can learn something new about games as a medium, about the potential of games as an expressive medium. This is based on empirical research. I've been working on it for quite a long time. It started out as my PhD thesis, my dissertation. And as you can see here, I was doing a lot of interviews. I did close to 50 interviews with people who were somehow active on the scene, either making games or playing games or organizing the scene in some way. And this is the actual voice recorder that I was using. I was looking at period documents. There were not really any magazines coming out at that time, gaming magazines, but there were computer clubs that I will be talking about, and those clubs put out newsletters for their members. And sometimes they're scanned online, or sometimes I got them from the people that I interviewed and I scanned them myself. So I was looking at that, but also magazines and TV reports and so on. Material artifacts, so I've been collecting hardware, DIY hardware also. So this is a computer mouse, DIY computer mouse built in the late 80s. There is currently no museum in the Czech Republic that would systematically collect artifacts related to the history of computer gaming, unfortunately. So most of the time I just borrow these things and I take nice photos, or I have nice photos taken by somebody else, and then I return them. So right now there's nobody who kind of collects these things institutionally. There are private collectors, but no institution right now. And the software. So I'll be giving examples of games from the 80s, and those are games that have been preserved. So the people who had those games in the 80s digitized their collections from cassette tapes or from floppy disks, and they put them online. So there are now a pretty big fan archives of old games that are playable using emulators. So the games that I'll be talking about, I played all of them. Yeah, it was fun sometimes. So this was my material. A little bit about the context. I don't think I had to talk too much. I was just today I've been to the Zeitgeschichtliche Forum in Leipzig. It's a great museum. I really enjoyed it. I mean, and there you can see a lot about the history of East Germany after 1945. But it was Czechoslovakia was in many ways similar. So there was a oppressive communist regime that limited travel to the West and also exchange of goods and information with the West. By something that's called the Iron Curtain, which was a factual curtain, offense, but also sort of like an intellectual or a barrier on information, and all kinds of other things. And I'll be talking about mostly the 80s, which is sometimes called the era of the period of normalization. So in 1968, we had this attempt at kind of more liberal politics within the Communist Party, but that was suppressed by the Soviet invasion in 1968, returning to like a more oppressive regime throughout the 70s and the 80s, but towards the 80s, after Gorbachev, it started liberalizing again, but I won't get to that. But yeah, so it was a country governed by one party, the Communist Party. But we shouldn't imagine it as just like a poor backwater country. It actually did have a well-developed industry. We produced cars like this one, beautiful car, the Škoda 1000. And for some time, it seemed that through extensive industrialization, the economy can kind of keep up with the West. But that really changed in the 70s and the 80s with the advent of electronics. So we were able to produce cars in the 60s, but not really computers. The government policy was to, there was some rhetorical support for computing and for computing education and programming education and so on, but the economy just wasn't capable of producing machines domestically. There were some exceptions, like these machines. So the IQ 151 and the PM85, those were computers manufactured in Czechoslovakia, but they were, in terms of performance, they were comparable to Apple II from 1978. So they were like 5 to 7 years behind the curve, and on top of that, you couldn't even buy them in stores. So these machines were produced in limited quantities and sold directly to educational institutions like schools, sometimes to computer clubs. So you wouldn't even be able to buy these in stores. Yeah. So yeah, now I'll be talking a little bit about the context, how people got hardware and how all these things work, computer clubs, and then sort of in the second half, or this the last 2/3, I will talk about games and some trends in game design in Czechoslovakia. So given that you couldn't really get a computer in a regular store, what could you do? So one thing was that there were these specialized shops with imported goods. And in East Germany there was Intershop, I think, if I remember correctly from my visit to the museum earlier today. In Czechoslovakia it was called Tuzex, and they sold limited quantities of imported goods, so including electronics, but there was very little, very small quantities of things. Very few computers, very few TVs. This is a photo of people queuing up overnight in a line for color TVs. But we could imagine a similar line for computers. So that was one option, not very accessible. Then there was another option, importing individually computers from the West. So sometimes, not everybody, but some people had special permits that allowed you to travel to Western countries, or just countries outside the Soviet bloc. Not everybody could do that, but some people could. And when those people did, and if they were computer fans, they would bring individual machines with them. Sometimes legally, and sometimes they would smuggle them, because the customs fees were very high for computers. And eventually, this computer, the Sinclair Zx Spectrum, a British machine, launched in 1982 in Britain, became the most popular platform in Czechoslovakia in the 80s. One of the reasons is that it was very versatile. You could connect it to, you didn't need much special hardware. You could connect it to a regular tape deck, cassette tape deck, to save software, load data, and so on. You could connect it to regular TV and so on. There was one reason. It was also the cheapest one that was available on the market at that time in the early 80s. And also it was very small. So I think Michael remembers, right? It was like not even an A4. It was like between A4 and A5, a very small computer, which made it easier to smuggle. And there were these stories of people smuggling the Spectrum disguised as sandwich. So they had like a pieces of bread, and between the pieces of bread there was the Sinclair Zx Spectrum. Or sometimes when they were smuggling them from West Germany, according to an apocryphal story, but it might be true, people would buy these kind of two-layer chocolate boxes that were popular in West Germany at that time. And they eat one layer of the chocolates, put the Spectrum inside, and then put the rest of the chocolates into the box and smuggle it into the country. And this is how the Spectrum, among other ways, became so popular in the country. Along with the Spectrum came a big influence of the British game industry, as opposed to, for instance, American or Japanese. The British game industry at that time was very much inspired by what was happening in the US and in Japan, but it was somewhat independent and the games were a bit different. So instead of Super Mario or Donkey Kong, what people would play would be Manic Miner, which was a British game from 1983, a big hit.
Maybe only is the mouse.
No, it's not my computer. I think it's something with the. Yeah, and the software at the time was mostly circulating on cassette tapes. Hard to imagine these days, but yeah, you would load computer programs from a cassette tape. It would take about 4 to 5 minutes to load a game into your computer from a cassette tape. But at the same time, it was quite practical because the cassette tapes were sold in electronic stores, unlike floppy disks, which were very rare at that time in Czechoslovakia. So when people imported these computers like the Spectrum or the Atari computers or the Commodore 64, but not so much Commodore 64, mostly Spectrum and Ataris, there was obviously no authorized service. There was nobody to repair these computers. There was no software market because there was no private enterprise in Czechoslovakia at that time. Private enterprise was banned and everything was nationalized. There was no software industry, so people were largely left to themselves. And they started these computer clubs in which they gathered, they exchanged software, know-how, engaged in programming and so on. And these clubs had to have official backing of some, they call it socialist organization, like Svazarm, which was a paramilitary organization which hosted clubs for aviation, automobile hobby.
Okay. No work.
Yeah. And other hobbies, including electronics and home computing, or the Socialist Youth Union. And Svazarm specifically, the paramilitary organization, pledged to support hobby computing, to track hobby activities, construction of machines, building of programs, including games. So they specifically list games in 1982 in like an official document. And this is all for the benefit of national economy and the defense of our homeland. But in reality, people went to these clubs to work on their individual projects, and there was very little supervision from authorities. Yeah, this is an image from one of the clubs. People, in fact, didn't really understand this connection with these organizations as some kind of commitment to the regime, really. We didn't mind being under Svazarm in any way said. I didn't care if it meant something for the army and the defense of the homeland and so on. We just took advantage of the regime to get to the things that we were attracted to and that we liked. So there was this interesting paradox. On the one hand, the government couldn't really secure computers for the people who wanted them, because there were already people who wanted to work with computers. But at the same time, they supported these hobby groups because they knew that eventually they will need all these people who would be experts in programming, hardware, and all these things in the future. So there was some support for these activities. the authorities didn't really know what was happening in the club. That's my suspicion. The clubs weren't really kind of surveilled that much, and people were very free to do what they wanted. And I just want to play for you this video. I'm sorry. So this is from this is like a short clip from TV news that's supposed to commemorate the 30th anniversary of Svazar, the paramilitary organization, and they're talking about, and you'll see it in the subtitles.
V zvežarnovských kolektívoch sa mládež učí správne chápať súčasnú politickú situáciu, správne sa pozerať na triedne rozdelený svet a rozumieť jeho rozporom. Všetka činnosť základných organizácií umožňuje formovanie uvedomelého vzťahu a postojov občanov k výstavbe a obrane socializmu.
But this was mostly just rhetoric. Actually, what happened in those clubs is you could see on the images, people were playing, British games. Like they were playing Daly's Decathlon, which was this famous sports game. So they weren't really learning that much about class divisions. They were, playing, experimenting, tinkering with electronics, and so on. And gaming and the computer hobby offered this. This niche in which people could fulfill their ambitions. This is a nice quote from an interview talking about the 80s. Back then you were born and there was a path laid out for you. You had to be a Spark, which was a youth organization for very small kids, a Pioneer for bigger kids, older kids, socialist youth, a communist, then take part in the socialist economy so that you have a secure life and eventually retire. You could deviate from this in a limited number of ways. This, hobby computing, was a shortcut, something that came out of the blue, something that nobody anticipated. Here you could fulfill your ambitions and find your talent. So this was a new activity, hobby computing, that at that time it seemed that the authorities didn't really control, they didn't know how to control. But not really for everyone. So if you've seen some of the pictures here. So I think there is something missing here. Women, right? In this regard, the Soviet bloc was very similar to the West in that there were these sort of long-standing stereotypes of which hobbies are suitable for women and which hobbies are suitable for men. And these clubs that we've been talking about were mostly male. Most of the people there were boys and men. But for those who went there, these were places where they could really fulfill themselves and work on interesting projects. And I mentioned that in Czechoslovakia there was no systematic surveillance of computer clubs by the state. In East Germany it seems that it was different. So the Stasi was actually surveying some of the clubs. And there's this cool article in Die Zeit by Dennis Giesler, which really kind of delves into the archives and talks about, basically analyzes the reports by the secret police about what was happening in those clubs in East Berlin. Yeah, so what was happening in those clubs? So people were tinkering with hardware. There was one important thing. For one, there was no authorized service, so if your computer broke down, you basically had to fix it yourself or find a friend who would fix it for you. Here you can see, so that's a Sinclair Zx Spectrum connected to like a DIY keyboard. This particular machine was owned by one of the developers that I'll be talking about, and he shared it with another family. So it was basically co-owned by two families. His computers were so scarce that two families shared one Spectrum, And given how much they were working on it, the keyboard soon gave out because it was not a very high-quality keyboard, it was a cheap computer. So what they came up with was this solution. They took mechanical switches and put the keys on the mechanical switches and connected it with this beautiful kind of rainbow cable, and it worked. People were building homemade joysticks, basically from scrap material. So what you can see here is a joystick that was donated to me by one of the clubs, and it has the stick itself, the lever. It's just a regular furniture knob that you kind of use to open your drawers. So that's a furniture knob, and for these buttons, they come from a calculator. So they got to the calculator and used it for the joystick buttons. And of course the mouse. And this is from upside down, so that you can actually see that it's built around a ping pong ball. There was a time when mice had balls in them, and this is built around a ping pong ball. You can even read that it was manufactured by Double Circle, a company made in China. This was to some extent. It was necessary to be able to build your own hardware, but sometimes it was just a challenge. So this mouse was designed to work with the Spectrum computer, but there was almost no software that required mouse or supported mouse for that computer. So this was mostly just a challenge. There's a competition, competing with each other, what kinds of hardware you can build. And the activity that we'll spend most time talking about, making games. So here you can see a grammar school student, František Fuka, here, showing his friends at the station of young technicians, one of the computer clubs, his own new creation, a computer game. As I said, there was no market, there was nowhere to sell those games. So why would people do it? I think part of the answer is in this very picture. So you can see how impressed those boys are, by what František just showed them. So in some way, this was about demonstrating your skills, your programming skills, your design skills, and entertaining other people. Games were circulating on cassette tapes, and this is an example. This is an inlay of one of those cassette tapes that I got from one of my interviewees. So it's like a generic tape, and you can see that there's this serendipitous collection of software on this tape, including some utility software, some copying software, some Western games, British games, ATF, Ocean Conqueror, Attic Attack, Alienate, Exelon, those are all British games, but also some domestic games. So, Jones is a game of Indiana Jones, but it's a Czechoslovak game of Indiana Jones. I will mention it in a minute. Dictator is the strategy game in which you play as a dictator of a third world country. It was made in Britain, but then was translated into Czech by local enthusiasts. And you can also see that the owner kind of embellished the inlay by ballpoint pen, I guess, and some crayons. And it's really cool just replicating some of the logos of the companies that made the games. Related to what I already said, it seems that computer games at that time were the least regulated medium. Because back then there was strict censorship regarding newspapers, film, music, rock music especially. So there was this strong belief that rock music is subversive and that it can contain all these ideological messages. But the authorities didn't seem that computer games can carry those messages, but they can. And now I think we know it, but they didn't, so they weren't really regulating the use of computer games, which is good for the people back then, and it's good for us, so that we can learn about them. So what kinds of games were being produced in the 80s in Czechoslovakia? So some of them were inspired by Western templates. So there were these, space, like science fiction shoot 'em ups. like Star Fox, which is unrelated to Nintendo Star Fox. It's just a coincidence. Which is a shoot-'em-up game inspired by Space Invaders and games like that, Galaga. By the way, Cybex Lab software means Cybernetic Experimental Laboratory. If only I knew which one of these cables is it called. Cybernetic Experimental Laboratory, but it's basically just one 16-year-old guy in Prague. So they would, even though these games were mostly made by amateurs and by individuals, they mimicked the Western industry in sort of using these sort of company names. They even called each other a firm, even though they were just like, teenagers. Exotron is another interesting game. It's also a shoot-'em-up game, but here you can see how they really tried to be Western, but they didn't really succeed. So this game is called Exotron, and the subtitle is Speedy Stony Wizards Attack, which makes absolutely no sense. And they just combined, whichever cool-sounding English words they could come up with, and made this sort of nonsensical title. But importantly, many of these games were text adventures. Have you played text adventure? Yeah, I guess most of you did, and now it's kind of experiencing a renaissance or resurgence with Twine games and so on. So text adventures were very popular. Indiana Jones 2 and Indiana Jones 1 by František Fuka, the guy on the photo from before, was making text adventures about Indiana Jones, who was a popular, sort of iconic Western hero. Indiana Jones films were actually shown in the country. With some delay, but they were shown, and Indiana Jones was a popular character. And a lot of games were made featuring Indiana Jones, of course unlicensed by George Lucas, but many of them nonetheless, and they were very influential. The reason why there were so many text adventure games, they were almost one half of all games produced in the 80s for the Spectrum, were text adventures. Is that they were somehow easier to produce. You didn't need the programming skills you would need for an. This is a bit so it was easier. They were easier to make, and also there was less competition. Because people couldn't really speak English that well, or read English, and they wouldn't really be able to play text adventures in English, but they were able to play text adventures in Czech. So there was no competition for foreign developers there. So these were games that were somehow inspired by Western sources. And just a figure, in total, including all games that were produced in the country in the 80s, over 300 games were made in that period, and that was only the games that have been preserved. So, it is, there were definitely games that have not been preserved. So only the preserved ones are over 300, and that is a lot, given that there was no industry, and all these games were made for free. Besides the games that were inspired by Western sources, there were also games that drew from local inspirations. So, for instance, Rychlé šípy, which is a text adventure game based on the Czechoslovak comic book series. And the comic book series was actually banned by the communists, but the game could come out because games were not regulated. Then, games taking place in the Czech countryside, like, this is called Taking the Castle in English. So, it takes place at a Czech castle. Or games like Piškvorks, which is like a digital adaptation of a non-digital game, which is called Piškvorky, and it's a variation on Dictator. But it's better than Dictator because it's an open world tic-tac-toe. It's not limited by the 3x3 grid, but it's basically played on as much graph paper as you have, as many squares as you have. And this is an adaptation of that. One of the few games that were co-authored by a woman, a mathematics student who came up with the AI routine for the AI that plays against a human in this game. And then there was a whole series of games that were partially autobiographical. So they were inspired by the experiences of the authors themselves. The first one of them was Fuxoft, but I'll use a different example. And I call these games hyperlocal games. And they are games created by people from a particular place, about that place, and about the people who inhabit it, written mainly but not exclusively for the local community. And this was one of the two major trends in game design that I'm talking about. And this definition is adapted from the definition of hyperlocal media. So, game I want to talk about is called Demon in Danger. It's from 1988, and it was written by Martin Mali. This is the description, it's the intro sequence. He borrowed some graphics from a British game, so this sprite is actually from a British game, but the rest of it is just a text adventure. It was very common to borrow graphics or sound from existing games. And the setting of the game is this. Dan Dare flees the crime scene. On November 13th, 1988, a strange person appeared in the village of Chleby. He was wearing an army uniform and an army hat. Those who know games for the ZX Spectrum would recognize him as Dan Dare, a comics hero. He was an agent of the studio Fuxoft, constructed by František Fuka. So you see a reference to another scene member. And scene members actually become characters in other people's games. His mission is to plant a bomb into the apartment of the competing studio, Demon, that is into the apartment of Martin Mali, who's the author of this game. So in this game, playing as one of the author's schoolmates, you have to go into his apartment and defuse the bomb that was set there. So this is a very hyperlocal game. It takes place in the very apartment that the author lived in, which still stands. This is the village of Chleby, just not too far from Prague. This is the apartment building that's still there, and this is the map of the game that I drew while I was playing the game. So you can actually walk through the apartment, and you get a very, interesting voyeuristic experience of visiting some kind of apartment in the 1980s when nobody's home, and you're going through the apartment and solving puzzles to save the author of the game. It has no graphics. It's a text adventure game again, but it has very detailed descriptions of the objects that you find. For example, there's like a doormat, and there's of course a key under the doormat. But you can examine the doormat and you can find out that it costs 25 Czech crowns, and it's made by this and that company and so on. So very detailed descriptions. And you will even go to Demon's office, which is basically Martin Mali, the author of the game's bedroom. And this is what it looked like in real life. It doesn't look as cool as the name would suggest, Demon's office, but this is what it looked like. So people, and this became a trend of sorts. And I will give you one more example, which is from the 1990s, but it was very much in line with what already started happening in the 80s. It's a game called Stopman, written by Jan Lonsky, who lived in a small town just outside of Pilsen. And you can see that it has all these references to the punk subculture. It's a very subversive game in a way. And I will play a video in which the author explains what the game is about.
Stopman jako postava je hrdina. Tady je dobrý zmínit, že jsem se s tou postavou ne úplně na začátku, ale někdy během vymýšlení hry identifikoval. Takže jde vlastně o mě. Respectman byl Pája Korbel. hlavní hrdina Stodman se dostane do školní budovy, zapadnou za ním dveře, zamknou se. V té školní budově musí získat materiály z výslechů Stodmana a Respektmana a tyto materiály v příslušné datové podobě poslat tajné organizaci, která zajistí chycení a potrestání příslušných viníků. A posledním úkolem je uniknout z budovy školy. Stodman měl svůj image. Charakterizovali ho tmavý brýle, opět 80. léta, klasický kulatý brýle, koženková nebo kožená bunda, holty, klasika rifle, co se tenkrát nosilo, obušek Respekt, právě od Respektmana, a často byl Stodman zobrazovaný ve výkopu a lavanda, prostě tu jednu nohu nahoře nad hlavou a s roztočeným Respektem. Malý Jan, dokud je malej, potřebuje chránit, potřebuje nějakou berličku nebo nějakou posilu. Takže tohle, to, co vidíte, je fantazie. Na druhou stranu, tuhle bundu jsem nosil skutečně, podobný brejle jsem nosil skutečně, nikoliv jako ochranu fyzickou, ale jako spíš způsob psychického zastrašování. Pixla zakomplexovaná byla výchovná poradkyně, skutečný jméno Ivanka Nosková. Přestože zní takhle roztomilé, tak ta paní měla na svědomí mě takhle s tím pájou, jak se pokusila nás, jak řekněme, dostat do spárů psychiatra, vždycky si z ročníku někoho vyhlídla, přesvědčila ho nebo ho uvrtala do nějakého problému a pak ho posílala do poradny do Havlovic.
Okay, sorry about that, but I think you got most of it. So basically the game, I don't know, I think we'll try to soldier on, but yeah, so this game was made as a bit of a revenge of sorts. So these guys were experiencing abuse at school, and they made a game about it in which, they return as superheroes, and and to deal with them and try to right the wrongs that that were done to them. And he commended it by saying we weren't weak. We had our own powers and abilities. One of them was the ability to express ourselves in a way that cannot be intercepted by them. And by them they mean, the people in power. In this case, that was the school counselor and the teachers. But it can be all kinds of people that are in power because they didn't really understand games, and games at that point were a medium that you could use to protest and to subvert authority. And this brings us back to the 1980s, because these subversive games started to appear around 1988. At that time, people were becoming less afraid to protest and voice their opinions because of the political developments in the Soviet Union, because of the perestroika and glasnost and these reforms that sort of sought to liberalize the Soviet bloc regimes to some extent. And around this time, people in Czechoslovakia, especially Prague and other major cities, start to convene at demonstrations against the communist regime. And this is when also the first subversive games start to appear. And the first I want to talk about, I don't know if it just fixes itself or the first is called Shaduchin, and it's the main character. It's Major Shaduchin of the Soviet Red Army, who originally appeared in this film, Solo Journey. It's a sort of a Russian kind of propaganda-style film, which was supposed to be a Soviet response to the Rambo movies. It was not that successful. But if you want to spend a fun evening with a bad movie, I think I totally recommend it. It's kind of fun in its own way. You can find it on YouTube, I think. Yeah, a lot of people at that time knew this film because cinemas in Czechoslovakia had to show a certain percentage of Soviet films. So people went to see this film, and it was quite well known. So this was the main character, and in the game, the goal is to defeat John Rambo. When you load up this game, the first thing that you see is the portrait of Shatochin with his name in Cyrillic. Then the other thing you see is this hammer and sickle. Why? It has nothing. I mean, it has nothing to do really with the content of the game. And I asked the authors, why did you put it in there? And they said, no one really respected that symbol anymore, and it was there for laughs. Okay, so they basically kind of took, I think what they wanted to express is that they kind of own this symbol, right? They can take the symbol of the oppressive regime and reuse it in their game and digitize it and put it there for laughs. So appropriating this iconography of the regime. And when you actually, go back. When you actually start playing the game, so I said that the goal is to defeat John Rambo. So on the surface, it would seem that it's like a pro-Soviet game, right? Because you're defeating Rambo. But in fact, they took advantage, the designers based in Bratislava in Slovakia, they took advantage of this unique affordance, a unique capability of games as a medium, and that is failure. Because in games, you can fail, and often you will fail. So although you're supposed to kill John Rambo, the Shatochin dies a lot of very humiliating and grotesque and comical deaths. As you can see here, these are not all of them, but there's a lot of them. One of my favorites is poisoned by crude oil and eaten by sharks simultaneously. That's one of the things that can happen to Shatochin. But he can also be kind of shot to death by North Vietnamese soldiers and by Rambo and so on. So there's a lot of potential for failure. So as the author puts it, Shatochin posed as an exemplary pro-regime game, but the jokes inside the game poked fun at it. And no one could reprimand me for making such a game because the first visual impression is that of a Soviet hero. Let's go on to another game. This one is called Přestavba, which is Czech for reconstruction, or also it's basically also perestroika. It's basically the same word. Yeah, I didn't. This works some magic. No? It's called Reconstruction, and it was released anonymously, which you can see here. It was released anonymously, but it was written by the same guy who made the game Star Fox, which is not the Nintendo Star Fox. So he was making these shooter games that were really hard to program on an 8-bit computer, but at the same time he made this protest game.
It's a Russian cable or something?
Maybe it's a Russian cable. Which is actually a very topical. I will get to. There would be something Russian in it. Yeah. So he didn't sign the game, and he said that he was so ingenious that in order for the secret police not to catch him, he made the game awfully primitive. So it was unlike the rest of his games, so that he couldn't be identified as an author of this game. And you can see that. It was released to commemorate the 20th anniversary of, as they put it, the liberation of Czechoslovakia by the Allied armies. But this is irony, of course, because that was the 1968 invasion of the Soviet occupying army. So the goal of the game is to destroy a statue of Lenin in this random Czech town. And while you do that, you can read all these motivational slogans which the Communist Party used at that time. But in fact, what you're doing is that you're defacing the symbols and destroying the symbols of the regime. So the point is to blow up the statue of Lenin with dynamite, but there are a few other things. So, for example, at one point you're in a dark corridor and you need to kind of find your way through, and so you need to light something up. And you create light by lighting up a copy of Marx's Kapital, which was a book. For us today, I think it has a very different meaning than for people in Czechoslovakia in the 80s, because for them it was a book that was whose kind of dogmatic kind of reading was at the basis of the kind of communist ideology at that time. So you burned Kapital, and the game said that it emits the light of progress, and you can progress in the game. And in order to do that, and that was, I think, one of the kind of most devious puzzles in the game, you had to light it on fire with a lighter, and the lighter was Russian. And the lighter, like the first time I played this game, the lighter didn't work, and I thought, okay, so yeah, maybe I just need to use something else. And I was really kind of helpless. And then I hacked into the source code of the game, and I found out that the lighter only works with a 30% probability, which I'm sure was a comment on the quality of Soviet products. And then I was able to finish the game. So it's full of these like little kind of satirical touches. And in the end, when you finish the game, it says, "Congratulations once more. We will all meet on August 21st on Old Town Square or anywhere else." Explicitly inviting the player to participate in the demonstration against the communist regime. As Fiedler, the author, puts it, it was a naive protest of sorts. He was disillusioned by the communist regime, and wanted to make games, and wanted to kind of become a professional game developer, and he wasn't allowed to do that, and he was very kind of disappointed and protesting the regime. The last example that I will spend some substantial time on takes place during the Palach Week, which was a series of protests, demonstrations, that took place in January 1989 and that were brutally suppressed by the police. The demonstrations went on for the whole week, and it was the first time when the communist police openly and violently suppressed the demonstrations. And it was a huge controversy, because before that, the oppression was mostly invisible. But here, in this case, you had photographs of police beating up protesters, and it created a huge amount of anger and disillusionment amongst the population. And a game was made about it, which is called The Adventures of Indiana Jones in Wenceslas Square in Prague on January 16, 1989. In which, Indiana Jones, by that time a very popular character in all kinds of text adventures, finds himself on Wenceslas Square, and your goal is to escape, go to the subway, and get to the airport. And in order to do that, you have to kill a lot of members of the communist police and the People's Militia, which was the armed arm of the Communist Party. It's a pretty difficult game. So there's like danger around every corner, and you really kind of have to progress in a very kind of clever way to be able to avoid all the dangers and win. Similarly to Chateauche, they take advantage of failure to emphasize the violence that took place during these protests. So this is one of the game over scenes, and they are very elaborate. Okay, you are standing at an unobstructed entrance into the subway. As soon as you showed up, an officer came to you and searched you. Having found nothing, he called on his comrades, and they beat you senseless. As they were running away to deal with some woman with a baby carriage, one of them lost a machete. You crawled for it and committed harakiri. Indiana Jones is dead. And there are many of these death scenes in this game. A lot of game overs. At the same time, you could also dispose of communist police in very brutal, violent ways. So this is another scene from early in the game. You are standing in front of the grocery house department store. The entrance into the subway is fortunately clear. An annoying man, probably a communist, is looking out of a balcony and happily watching the good work of the members of the public security, which was the name for police. You can go down to the right or inside. You see a cop. So I had picked up an axe and I typed use axe. You drove your axe so deep inside his skull that it cannot be pulled out. You see a dead cop. And the cop has something that you will use later and progress through the game like this. So it's a very violent game. Somewhat exaggerated, I would say. So I mean, there was violence, of course, during the demonstration, but this is an exaggeration. And in a way, the way I see it, in a way, is that this is similar to what we saw in the case of the punk rock game, Stuntman, right? So somebody returns to a place of trauma and relives that traumatic experience, but from a point of view of a hero that is empowered. In this case, Indiana Jones. Indiana Jones, is clever and stronger than a regular demonstrator, participant in a demonstration, so he can fight back. So in a way, it's this empowering moment. This game. But we don't know who made this game. It was released anonymously. But from the quite accurate descriptions of the geography and the events, it's possible that it was somebody who actually was taking part in the demonstration, but we don't know that. So this was released. Yeah, we don't really know the date, but it was probably released shortly after the demonstrations. The last one that I want to talk about shortly was about another demonstration, the one that is probably the most famous. On the 17th of November 1989, there was a huge student demonstration against the regime, which ended with a standoff between the communist police, the riot police, and demonstrators on Národní třída, this kind of big boulevard in Prague. You can see, the slogans like "Nechceme násilí," "We don't want violence," which was one of the major slogans used at that rally. And there was a game made about it, called just simply 17th November 1989, which reuses the same slogans. In this game, the goal is to escape the violence, escape the police, go into an apartment building, and find video recording equipment to record proof of what was happening during those events, and send that to Western journalists. And in a way, this is also very topical, because at that time, access to impartial information was very limited, because TV and newspapers were all censored and were dominated by party propaganda, and people really wanted to find out what actually happened. So this desire for true information about the events was something that was very much present among the people. So all of these games, really tell us a lot about what people were going through, about lives of ordinary people, about the concerns of people in Czechoslovakia. And one more thing about this game. So I think you can notice on this loading screen, this intro screen, that something's a bit off. The face and the hand of the riot police member are much more realistic than the rest of the image. And I was, I was really kind of wondering why that is. And then, I was browsing the internet at night, and I came across this image, The Way of the Exploding Fist, sort of a martial arts game, an Australian game, but released in the UK in 1985. And they just took basically part of this image and quickly redrew it. And this is not an exception. It was very common for people to just take bits of existing games and recombine them, and rearrange them, and appropriate them to express themselves. So to conclude, so I would like to think of making games in Czechoslovakia as a kind of engagement. There were three different kinds of engagement. The first one was repurposing and infiltrating state infrastructure to create these spaces and networks. I didn't really explain the word yeah, but basically means these clubs that were supported by state but weren't really overseen by the state. And there was a lot of organizational work behind those clubs. The second one, repurposing the medium to empower themselves and talk about their own experience. For example, in those hyperlocal games. So, not only making games for entertainment, but making games about their own experiences. I think what was interesting about these games from the 1980s was that people weren't really kind of limited by the ideas of what a good game should look like. They weren't really kind of socialized into kind of thinking about a particular kind of set of kind of technical and kind of gameplay values that each game should have, and they were, experimenting. And third, they expressed their discontent with the political situation through these activist games. So I've been mostly talking about my historical research, but I just want to point out one thing about sort of my kind of practical experience. So I used to write games when I was a teenager, and then for a long time I didn't. But recently, I was thinking that it might be nice to make these games, especially these activist games, which I think are of like great historical interest and importance, to a wider audience. You can still play those games on an emulator, but it's not trivial to run them on an emulator. So, me and my friend remade. I'm trying to translate it. Oh, it says it's been translated. Okay, well, it has not. Okay, but try it once more. Oh, it's because I'm offline. Yeah. Okay, doesn't matter. But yeah, my most recent project was this one. So now it's all falling apart. So we created these remakes of these games, three games: Reconstruction, Indiana Jones in Wenceslas Square, and 17/11/1989. For web browser technology, so that anybody can play them. But for now, they're only available in Czech, but we'll be also translating them into English. And this project really gave us a very good understanding of how those games work. Like, you really kind of have to know the game intimately if you want to remake it properly. So you wanted the mechanics to be exactly the same, maybe a bit more user-friendly, but otherwise the puzzles had to stay the same. And these games were, they were made by amateurs, and sometimes they don't really follow the principles of good programming. There's a lot of jumps, a lot of go-tos, and it's really hard to implement a badly programmed game in like today's kind of standard kind of programming languages. So it was a bit of a challenge, but it was a very interesting challenge, and hopefully this will be soon available in English, and possibly German. And that's it for me. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you. And just one more thing. If you're interested in getting the book, I have some leaflets here, which will give you a 30% discount if you're interested in buying a copy. Should I?
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jaroslav. Sorry for this Russian cable. I have no idea how it works. Last week it was different, so okay, we have to check this. So, are there any questions to Jaroslav?
You said that the games in the were not so regulated and not so controlled, but were they official illegal, or was just not mentioned anywhere?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there was no regulation at all. So in terms of copyright, it was very unclear. So there was copyright for software was only introduced into Czechoslovak copyright law in 1990. So before 1990, it was not protected by copyright. But at the same time, there were some international agreements between Czechoslovakia and other countries that would theoretically kind of protect foreign games, but I'm not really sure. So in terms of copyright, it wasn't really regulated, and in terms of censorship, I think it was just there was no effort to regulate them. So there was like it was not that it would say somewhere that games are not censored, but they just kind of forgot about it. They just weren't mentioned, as you said. Yeah.
All right. I would have another question. What happened to the computer clubs after the Iron Curtain vanished?
Yeah, that's a great question. So of course, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, the clubs weren't really as important as they used to be, because now you could actually buy a new keyboard. You could buy manual. You could buy programs with manuals, and there was a market and so on. So part of them stayed, especially those that worked with the youth. So for like school kids, the clubs kind of went on. The clubs for more adults, some of them transformed into commercial companies. So one of the major clubs was they were known by their ordinal numbers, right? So there was the 602nd club in Prague, which was probably the most influential in the country. So that actually kind of splintered into several commercial companies.
Oh, right.
One of them was producing word processing software. They already started doing that in the late 80s, but now they kind of legalized it as like a private company, and they were selling it for money. Another part of the club went on to become a hardware distributor, and so on. But this was not without objections of some people. Some people really kind of disappointed that now like everybody just wants money and make money on everything. And before that, like we used to share all the knowledge that we had. So some people were really kind of sad about the changes in many ways. But yeah, most of the clubs kind of slowly kind of dissolved in the 90s.
All right.
You said that the games were used as a medium to criticize or educate about the regime. How many people were actually reached by this kind of medium? How many people did use a computer and were able to play these games? Every 10th person, or even less?
Yeah, that's a great question. I should have mentioned it in the presentation. Yeah, so there was about 100,000 owners of the Spectrum computers in 1990. So we can say in 1989 it was the same. 50,000 Atari owners. And like if we look at the 1990 statistics, it seems that about 2% of households had a home computer. So it was not a lot. It was enough to create a lively community, but not like a widespread phenomenon. So it was still quite niche. So then, of course, the impact of these games was limited. So it's not that these games brought down the Iron Curtain. I think that what I want to show, I think, was more that people in Czechoslovakia in the 1980s really kind of explore the possibilities of the medium. So they discovered all these possibilities that this medium can have relatively early on. But the actual impact of these games, yeah, probably not as much as other kinds of activist media, like student papers, or samizdat, is kind of unofficial kind of illegally circulated books, or even folk music. So that was very popular. So the folk musicians playing guitar and singing sort of anti-regime songs. They had bigger impact than these computer games, definitely.
I can remember I sat with my cousin in Bulgaria in front of such games, and it wasn't only one man of the family, or there were a lot of friends sitting in front of the thing. So I think the impact could be more than these two-person, maybe 5-6% or something like this. And I'm not sure how big the impact of the papers you mentioned was in relation to this. So maybe it had more impact than it's obviously seen.
Yeah, you're right. You're definitely right that people used to gather around computers and more than one person played. But with these student papers, I think it also kind of was read, in groups. It's really hard to say. And out of those, let's say 200,000 people who had home computers, I think not all of them actually got these games. I I would say it was a minority. I think most people wanted games that were entertaining, and I think that these still. So although there was no explicit regulation, the authors were still a bit concerned about their safety. So they released them anonymously, and they even explicitly. The author of the game Reconstruction says that they only copied it for people who they knew well. So if there might have been a suspicion that somebody is like a spy or something, so they wouldn't give it to them and so on. So I think that it didn't spread as much as other games. I don't know. You've already had a question, so yeah.
Really short one. Are there instances of developers who actually got into trouble for making games that were so critical?
Not that I know of. And I've been looking for evidence of that in the secret police archive. Doesn't seem to be any, but it's always possible that it will come up at some point. When somebody else does the research, but it seems that they didn't get into trouble. Also, one of the reasons is also that this was really just before the end of the regime. So maybe eventually, if the regime went on, they would get into trouble. But there's no evidence that they did.
How common was it for people who owned a computer to play? Because right now, only a small percentile of people who own computers and work with them.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that a majority did, because at that time, most of the computers that were among the people in Czechoslovakia were 8-bit computers, which weren't really practical for doing serious work. So there was some word processing software. There were some spreadsheets, but it was very impractical because most people only have cassette tapes, and saving stuff on cassettes and only from cassettes was very slow. So the practical, serious or productive use of these computers was very limited. So most people had them either to play games or to just play around, programming and experimenting. So I would say that the majority of people who had computers at that time actually played games. But at the same time, I also must say that it was considered, it was considered an aberration or not really normal if somebody only played games. And especially in the clubs, there was this very strong rhetoric that, okay, you can play games, but you should also create something new. You should also write your own programs. So it was much more common for gamers to write their own games. Yeah.
You just mentioned that the criticizing games were mostly shared among friends or anonymous to a larger audience. Was there an official or an underground market for games that were probably imported from other countries, from the Western countries, that weren't criticizing anything but were actually sold and not shared?
Yes and no. So Western games were circulating in the country, as you saw on the tapes, and the distribution network was quite efficient. So maybe a month after release in the UK, the game would be played in Prague, for instance. Some people did sell illegal copies of games for money, but it doesn't seem to be that frequent. And it was a bit different in each country. For instance, in Poland, there were these computer markets, and there were these outdoor locations in Warsaw where you could buy computer parts and computers and games. and it was very common for people to actually sell copies of Western games. In Czechoslovakia, it seems that clubs were much more important, and people usually got games for free in clubs or shared them with their friends. But you had to pay fees to be member fees for being in the club, but they're like trivial amounts.
So, can you give us some information about what can the gaming industry today learn from the gaming industry? It's not the industry, but the gaming programming in the Czech Republic or behind the Iron Curtain. Are there something like top three things or something like this? What you stumbled over?
Yeah. I think that I've already mentioned. One thing was that people weren't afraid to make games about themselves, and I think that like this personal touch and these autobiographical games, I think they're very important, and it's something that we kind of see coming back in indie games, for instance. So I mean, and there are many games like that, and just one that comes to mind is Dead Dragon Cancer, which was a game about a traumatic experience of a family whose kid had cancer. And it's a game about their experience, and it's a very personal game. And there are more games like this. And I think it's, it's like a welcome addition to the palette of games that we have, games that are personal. And another one, activist games, and there are activist games. But I think they still can be. I think some of the activist games these days are like very kind of intellectual, and they are maybe just a little bit too complex. I think there's this Italian designer Paolo Pedercini, known as Mola Industria, who makes these activist games, criticizing different kind of aspects of today's societies, and they're very kind of high intellectual games. And I think that it's okay to have protest games that are emotional. Like the Indiana Jones and Wenceslas Square. It's a very emotional game. Why not make emotional activist games like that? And the third thing, I think that it was a bit unintentional in the 1980s, but I already mentioned that as well. But the fact that people who made these games were not really aware of the standards of making a good game, I think it was very liberating. Just forgetting about what is good gameplay. Most of these games, they didn't really have good gameplay, but they were, kind of fun nonetheless, because you can learn something about the life of a certain person, and and there's interesting jokes and so on, and not having to concentrate so much on polishing this or that part of fun gameplay, I think, allowed them to be a bit more creative, not maybe coming up with some new kind of gameplay. There was, for instance, a big trend in the 80s. So I was talking about Indiana Jones text adventures. There was another series of text adventures that were a bit like hacking games. There are some games like that now. It basically simulates, basically pretends that your computer isn't like another computer, and you're kind of hacking some, you're connecting to some networks and trying to guess passwords, and you basically play as a hacker. And there are some games these days, the names are escaping me, but this was also a trend in the 1980s. Because people were fascinated by computer networks, but they didn't have access to those networks. So they made games about being in a computer network and having powerful computers that can kind of break into the bank, and you can kind of steal money online and all these things. It was all kind of make-believe, but just compensating for kind of this lack by these kind of clever workarounds of games. It's interesting.
Maybe the last question.
Did some of the, I'm gonna say, hobby developers manage to go into the gaming industry professionally later on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some of them did for some time. So the guy who made Reconstruction, which was the game in which you blow up the statue of Lenin, and who made Star Fox, then went into commercial development and stayed there for some time. But in the end, like most of them left the industry because I mean, either they were tired of it or they found like a more lucrative job in the IT sector. So some of them were, and actually I didn't mention them, but if you're familiar with the Czech company Bohemia Interactive that did Arma and DayZ and these games, so that company is owned and was founded by two brothers, Marek and Ondřej Španěl, who were making homebrew games in the 80s already. So that's like one of the examples of people who kind of stayed in the industry. There aren't that many of them who stayed until today. And there are also some other stories, because some of these people were, the people who made games in the 80s in Czechoslovakia, I think they were in kind of two major groups. One of them were interested in computing and programming, and those usually kind of today work in IT or game industry. And then there was another another group that was mostly interested in games as media of expression. And interestingly, a lot of the people that I talked about are today journalists. So František Fuka, who made the Indiana Jones games, not the activist one, but just the regular Indiana Jones games. So he's a film journalist. The guy who made Demon in Danger is also a journalist. So in a way, I think for people in the 80s, games were also like a means of verbal expression. So they would write in these text adventure games, and they would later become writers themselves.
Okay, thank you very much. Vielen Dank, dass ihr da wart. Denkt dran, Ende März, denke ich, wird der dritte Vortrag dann gestartet. Und kommt gut nach Hause und ja, bis zum nächsten Mal. Vielen Dank.